How can we know what the truth is concerning origins? According to evolution, a blob of goo changed via the zoo into you. Of course, that begs the question, where did the blob of goo come from? And the answer to that is that it came from chemicals. Where did those chemicals come from? Way back, they came from stars. Where did the stars come from? And if we follow this backwards far enough, eventually we'll have to say, well, there was nothing which exploded to make everything. According to creation or intelligent design, creationists say that there was an intelligent being who had no beginning, who created certain kinds, for example, the dog-wolf kind and human kind. And then he instructed them to reproduce after their kind, which they did, but within that created kind, he allowed there to be genetic variation, which suited the particular population to its particular circumstances. So let's summarize this. According to evolution, we start with nothing. According to intelligent design, we start with God. In evolution, that nothing becomes everything. In intelligent design, God creates everything and organizes and designs it using his intelligence. According to evolution, everything is organized over a long period of time and by a lot of chance into the complexity that we see today and the appearance as if it were designed even though it was not designed. According to intelligent design, those created kinds then diversified during variation within that created kind. So how are we meant to know what is really the truth? The study of getting to know is called epistemology. There are different ways of getting to know something. You can't say that one way is necessarily wrong. It really depends upon the context, which way of getting to know is appropriate, and you have to realize that each one of them has strengths and weaknesses. I think probably the majority of what we personally know comes from some higher authority which we believe to be reliable, and so accept their word as true. Now I've got a picture here of a Bible because yes, this is one form of knowledge. However, belief in the Bible is not the only way in which we can come to know something by believing in a higher authority. When we take our parents' word as true, or our teachers, or something that we read, the author's word, or some scientist's theory as being true, then we are really gaining knowledge by believing that higher authority. Now this is a very efficient way to get to know something. For example, imagine if we would reject learning anything from a higher authority as being invalid. Say we were learning science and someone presented Newton's laws to us. We would have to reject it because we haven't ourselves yet demonstrated them to be so. We'd have to first derive them inductively and then, do experiments, and we'd have to have Newton's mind and Newton's lifetime to do that in. And then, of course, that's only a fraction of what there is to learn in life, but even just in physics. So maybe now we need to understand relativity as well. Well, we'd need Einstein's mind and Einstein's lifetime to develop that too. So, obviously that is ridiculous. So instead, we accept that Newton and Einstein were higher authorities on physics than ourselves, and so we learn from them and gain the knowledge which they agonized over many years, and we learn that in a relatively short period of time. So there's a strength in this kind of epistemology in that it is efficient. There's a weakness though, because of course we might be wrong in accepting a certain authority as being valid. We might have a teacher who teaches us incorrect facts. Our parents, they don't know everything, of course, and so they might teach us something that's false. And we all know that, there are lots of superstitions and old wives' tales and whatever it might be that are incorrectly passed down from generation to generation. And so there is a danger in this epistemology. To reduce that danger, we need some method of verifying that authority. We need to be able to approach that authority critically. We need to be critical in a respectful way, of course, but what I mean by critical is that we need to look carefully at whether our source of information is valid. Now, in many ways, the example of learning physics from Einstein and Newton is very different, of course, to learning things that are supernatural from something like the Bible. Because, of course, with, not Einstein, but Newton, we can can go and do experiments. We can have other forms of knowing to check up on the way in which we originally got to know about physics, namely by believing our teachers. We can go and verify that with some kind of experiment. Whereas the knowledge that we gain from the Bible about supernatural events cannot be verified by experiments, because experiments only deal with the natural world. Now, in the case of the Bible, we need to do the same. I mean, it's not enough to have faith. You can have faith in a lot of stuff that's a load of nonsense. So it's not enough to have faith. You've got to have faith in the thing that is true. So how do we know that the Bible is a valid higher authority, that it is really God's word, and so that we can believe it? Now, of course, the scope of this talk is not great enough to be able to do justice to that. But just to mention a few points. The fact that the Bible is internally consistent and also verified externally by history is a strong validating support that shows that the Bible is a believable source. For example, there are a number of prophecies in the Bible which you can clearly trace to actual historical events which occurred after the prophecy was made. And the prophecies accurately predicted what would happen, even though the prophecies were made in a context where it was not likely that that would happen. Another way of getting to know something is by philosophy. Philosophers make deductions based on reason. In other words, they think about their thinking and they analyze their logic, and they are critical of one another's logic, and by doing so refine what they think is truth by trying to reason through what's truth. Now, there is the advantage here that reasoning and logic can be subjected to scrutiny by one's peers, so that there's a transparency in this that helps, determine a degree of reliability. But there's a massive limitation to philosophy, and that is that something can be logical without being true. And that's very clear from history. That the Greek philosophers, ancient Greeks, were wonderful philosophers and would spend hours and hours debating logic. But if one looks at the science that actually came out of that culture, there isn't really much to show. Aristotle, for example, he taught a lot of stuff which, I suppose he reasoned about for many hours. And that stuff was taught for 2,000 years. But the problem was it wasn't based on any observation, and so it was a load of nonsense. And only once people started to realize that we actually need to get our knowledge from what exists by actually looking at nature and observing it, only then did people realize, Aristotle didn't quite have it right after all. And so that brought in a value for an epistemology based on data. Data means things that we can measure, things that we can observe. Observe means what we can take in with our senses, what we can see, hear, taste, smell, touch. Now, this category of epistemology can be broken up into two. One is when we can actually do experiments. Now, this is a very strong form of getting knowledge because it's repeatable. What happens in an experiment is that you have 2 or more treatments which you treat differently in one respect, called the independent variable, and you test what effect that has on another variable called the dependent variable. You control all other variables, and then based on the difference you find between the treatments, you can see the cause-effect relationship between the 2 variables. Now that's repeatable. You can write up your experiment, submit it to a panel of experts who can then scrutinize what you've written. They can even go and redo it. And when they redo it, and if they find different results, then they will question you. There's a transparency, there's an accountability, and it's based on what physically actually exists in the universe. And so that is a very strong form of getting knowledge. If we look around at the progress of the modern world, it can be traced back to the time when people started to realize, experiments are valuable. because this form of knowledge, once it became acceptable and valued, caused an explosion in the amount of valid knowledge available to people, and therefore in the power that people have in manipulating the natural world. So this is really a very strong form of knowing. But unfortunately, not everything can be experimented on. So if science were limited to knowing about things which can be experimented on, we wouldn't know very much, and science would be a very limited subject. So there are other ways of doing science besides using experiments. And unfortunately, the issue of origins largely has to be tested with this kind of getting to know. Because you see, there was nobody present at the time when life originated or when stars originated. So there was no one there to do experiments. There was no one even there to record it historically. One could, of course, question that because there was someone there, namely God, we believe, and he did record it. But if we, for now, say we're not going to bring God into the equation, we're just going to reason this intellectually, there was no human being there present. And so a lot of the knowledge that we have about origins has to come from data that we reason about, even though we cannot use experiments on that data. And when we gain knowledge that way, there are a lot of dangerous issues that can come in that can cause us to form wrong interpretations of the data. It's very difficult to really know what the data is actually telling us about the truth. And yet, if you want to deny that there's no way of using that data because we can't use experiments, then you must just accept that science cannot answer any questions about the origin of life. So, my point is that each of these ways of knowing has its place, but it also has its strengths and its weaknesses, and we must use that way of knowing in the right context, in appropriate context, and apply critical thought to each way to try evaluate the validity of that way of knowing. Some people think that in the debate about origins, evolution is a scientific alternative, whereas intelligent design or creation is a religious or faith-based alternative. So then quite a lot of intellectual people might have the attitude that they don't want to believe in something which is just a religion because they feel that that's superstitious and so somehow weaker in knowledge than what a science should really be. However, in fact, both evolution and creation and any other alternative you want to propose for the origin of life and origin of the universe is at its origin, at its start, at its base, a faith. Why do I say that? Let's look again at what these two viewpoints say. According to evolution, we start with nothing, and that becomes everything. According to intelligent design, we start with God, and he makes everything. Now notice, both of these are not natural explanations. Science only deals with the natural. What do I mean by that? Science assumes that there are laws of nature that always operate. If I drop something, gravity will act on it. It doesn't matter if I drop it in the morning or the evening, at the pole or the equator, gravity will act on it. Imagine if sometimes the laws of nature worked and sometimes not. We wouldn't be able to do science. So, science has to do with the natural order of things and the study of that. Now we know that one of the laws of nature is that mass and energy cannot be created or destroyed. But here we have nothing becoming everything. This is a supernatural event. It's not a natural one. Science cannot deal with this event. So can you see that saying nothing becomes everything requires a belief in something other than the laws of science, in some supernatural event. Just as believing that God, an eternal being, creates everything is a supernatural event. That's also defying the law of conservation of mass energy. And so both evolution and intelligent design have at their origin, at their start, a belief statement, a non-natural, supernatural claim. And so both of them require belief in a higher authority.